Dr. 914, George Hussey from Automobile Atlanta. And today we're going to do a tour of a 75-76 914 2-liter engine. I get many questions every day about where vacuum lines go, where electrical connections go, what are certain components and how they work together, and that's what I'm going to go over today. This engine we just pulled out of a 75 model 2-liter, and actually it has fairly low miles on it, but it had been sitting for years, as are many 914s that we get in these days. So you'll see some leaves and debris and some things out of place, but I'll go over those carefully. I purposely chose this engine because it wasn't in the best condition. This engine is obviously a far cry from the pristine one pictured in the original factory brochure from 1975. But that doesn't mean that when you're reconditioning your engine you can't get it to look just like this, except for the fact that no longer are the colorful vacuum lines available. Continental, who made the originals, now only makes charcoal and black ones, and a green one for the vacuum retard. So as I slightly take apart this engine, I'll show you first the various components. Starting with the air cleaner assembly. This, by the EGR, exhaust gas recirculation port, we can tell instantly that this is a 75-76 2-liter air cleaner assembly. Vacuum lines first, the auxiliary air valve, which adds extra air when the engine is cold, the auxiliary air valve being right here and connected to the intake manifold. It actually causes a vacuum leak, adding extra air, like I said, when the car was cold, as the car needs more fuel and more air to warm up. Then the engine oil breather, the 75-76 2-liters did away with the head port breathers and only made one central one from the oil filler. This vacuum line should be cloth covered, but they have discontinued that, and somebody went to the local auto parts store, made in USA, and bought just any kind of a vacuum line, 3/4 to put onto this. It's hard to get off, so I'll put that aside. We can see the cold start valve here. This works only at 40 degrees or colder when cranking the engine, not when running, but when cranking. And it is coupled with the thermo time switch, which is right over here, and this is a ground subject to heat. So after like 10 seconds, it stops injecting because it has a heating element that heats up and cuts the circuit, so it's no longer a ground to fire the cold start valve. This is the control unit, which basically, I say, is like the 1.7s and the earlier 2-liters, but it has its own 039 part number for the 75-76. This is the mixture control, only for mixture on idle. It doesn't do anything else other than that, just slight adjustments for the idle mixture. The early 914s didn't have this Porsche thinking, VW Porsche, that they were perfect in their mixture, didn't need any adjustment, but later found out they were wrong, so they added a little mixture adjustment. This piece here is mounted on the side of the 914 body behind the battery, and it's the air pressure sensor. It has a diaphragm in it that is controlled by manifold vacuum, and it increases or decreases the duration of injection through the control unit. This lead right here actually goes in to the engine sheet metal, and it's called the head temperature sensor lead. It senses the head temperature and adjusts the mixture accordingly. So when it's 40 degrees out, it has 2,750 ohms of resistance. When it is 190 degrees engine operating temperature, it virtually has 50 ohms or less resistance. The 2,750 ohms resistance to the control unit increases radically the duration of injection. These fail by the resistance going crazy. So you could be driving with a fully warm engine, and all of a sudden the head temperature sensor changes 2,750 ohms all of a sudden, and the engine floods at idle, and then it won't start for a while. These are finicky, and I suggest that they are replaced after all these years. The two injectors, they should be green colored on the head. That means they're for a 2-liter. There were early 2-liter green ones and late 2-liter green ones. If they're yellow, they're 1.7s. They're not supposed to be on a 2-liter engine. These should have boots on them, but they don't. You can see the one is deteriorated and about to fall off. The other one is not here. Usually it has gray ones in the front and black ones in the rear. That designates front and rear injector leads, so you won't mix them up. The unique thing about the 75-76 2-liter is the air pump. Increasing federal emission standards meant that something had to be done to control what comes out of the tailpipe. And the barbaric early emission standards were such that they grabbed for straws and did anything to dilute the parts per million of HC and CO coming out of the tailpipe. The way they did that was not to actually clean up the way the engine burned, but yet inject extra air so that the parts per million were lesser. So they came up with this air pump, which actually pumped clean air into the exhaust stroke, thus diluting what is coming out of the tailpipe. It's almost like you have a sink full of debris and you pour an extra 5-gallon bucket of water, so when it drains, there's not so much debris because there's more water in the debris, but the same amount of debris is coming out. So a rudimentary device that really didn't do much, but it let it conform to emission standards. So all this gizmo plus the belt to drive it. And as you can see, this air pump is frozen, as most of them became in the later years because they hurriedly made it and plopped it on there without much thought. The drive belt is gone because obviously it wouldn't be able to turn the air pump. And as you can see, because of this, it had to drive an extra pulley, the engine did, and that robbed some horsepower. So the best thing they could do is just disconnect this. You're not going to really pollute anymore. It's going to have the same amount that comes out of the tailpipe. And these cars are fairly clean for their day, really, the fuel injection, but you'll have more horsepower by not having the belt connected. This has the optional timing mark on it also. A lot of the VW buses had this to show you exactly where the timing mark should be, 27 degrees before top dead center. Now, the funny thing about this is, how are you going to access that with a timing light? There's just no way. The timing is in this plug right here, which is also impossibly hard to get to with the air pump in the way. But that's where you set the timing on the 914. While we're looking at that, you can look down in here. All 2-liter 914 engine ID numbers are down in the hole between the oil filler and the front impeller housing. This starts off GC, which I know is a 75-76 2-liter. GB is a 74, and GA is a 73 2-liter. The 1.7 and 1.8s have their serial number over at the back of the engine. So instant way to tell it's a 2-liter is look down in the hole, and if it says GA, GB, GC, it's a 2-liter engine. In addition, you can look at the intake manifold on the 2-liter, and it will have 3 bolts, 1, 2, 3, bolting the intake runner on. The 1.7 and 1.8s have 4. Additionally, the 2-liter has the spark plugs going in from the side rather than in from the top like the 1.8 and the 1.7s do. So to continue with some of the vacuum lines, we talked about the auxiliary air valve vacuum line here, and now we can look at this. This is the retard vacuum line for the vacuum retard assembly, which is right over here. In fact, this one's on the wrong side because it's a different retard. This should be on the bottom, but the large one coming out from the side is the retard, and the small one coming out of the top is the advance. Late 74, they discontinued the advance because it let too much unburned fuel go out of the pipe, so they discontinued it, and all they did is stuck, and this is too large, they stuck a 3.5 piece of vacuum line on and let it breathe to the wind. As you can see, this is correct, believe it or not, except it needs a 3.5 vacuum line. This originally, when it was the advance, was connected to this port right here, which you can see is blanked off. 73 and early 74s both had the port for the 3.5. Neat trick these days is to tap this, put a fitting on it, and connect a 3.5, and you'll get a little extra oomph when you accelerate. This device is the throttle switch. It works like an, I'm at a loss for words. It works like a accelerator pump on a carburetor. It catches the initial acceleration and increases the duration of injection right away until the control unit can catch up. Without this, you'll notice it sort of lags off idle when you're accelerating. This is the air temperature switch, which senses incoming air and the temperature of it and adjusts the mixture accordingly also. So if it's very, very cold out, this is going to catch it in time and add more fuel. This is the helper spring for the accelerator. It actually fits, not here, you see the hole here? That was the 1718 hole for the spring. It actually fits over here, right there, and that's where the accelerator cable connects. The air pressure sensor lead comes off from the top here. The two fittings here, over here, and the 75, 76, I may say, have fewer vacuum lines, which is a good thing. The old 17s have so many vacuum lines, it's very confusing, but these have straightened it out a little bit. So these two ports are for the decel, we call it decel valve, pneumatic deacceleration valve, which let the idle down more slowly, therefore not letting unburned gas out of the tailpipe again. A lot of this unburned gas thing is very, very legitimate because unburned gas is more of a pollutant than thoroughly burned gas. They complain about carbon dioxide these days, but back when the hydrocarbons and the CO, the carbon monoxide, were in great quantities coming out, they had no idea what. This engine is now well taken apart, but I can still show you now that the distributor cap is in its correct place. The distributor vacuum advance needs to be facing around this area. I would say that for proper timing, this distributor vacuum advance is going to point about here, but you can never tell until you check the timing at 3,500 RPM after you set the dwell. Dwell is how long the points stay open according to how far the distributor rotor turns. The smaller the gap, the larger the dwell, the wider the gap, the smaller the dwell. And when the distributor is in its correct place, this is number 1, 4, 3, 2. So number 1 is right here, number 2 is right here, number 3 is right here, and number 4 is right here. So 1, 4, 3, 2 is the firing order, and you want to make sure that your distributor looks like this, and number 1 about the 1030 position, and when the rotor is on number 1, that's when you also can check the valves. 1, 4, 3, 2. So this is between 3 and 2 right there. Fuel lines are coming from the bottom of the car. The 75, 76 had the fuel pump at the front. So the fuel lines came into the car through the shelf on the engine, and the deliver fuel line is attached to the right rear injector rail. Too many reverse these fuel lines and wonder why the car won't start. So the fuel flows this way. It comes through the number 4 and number 3 injectors, comes across the engine, over to here, into the number 1 and 2 injectors, then finally through the fuel pressure regulator, and then back across and down to the return line on the fuel pump. Please note this has the so-called HO. HO is for a campaign through the federal government to replace components that were deemed defective, like these original cloth fuel lines that the battery deteriorated. So the famous HO campaign would replace these fuel lines with these high-pressure rubber ones impervious to battery acid, clean the battery area, put a nice battery cover on it, and put new injector seals. That was basically the HO campaign, and these clamps that are non-intrusive. You don't want clamps that have serrades in them because that pinches and hurts the line and can cause a fuel leak. Too many 914s have burned because of improper fuel line maintenance, and we want to avoid that. So make sure you use the clamps that are non-intrusive there. There are two harnesses for the engine. The first one is the ignition harness, which also controls the starter, and the second one is the control unit harness. And these emanate from the relay board. The relay board having 4 relay positions, and I'll point these out. Obviously, these are corroded because they haven't been in there for a while because this engine hasn't run and it's got the wrong fuses. But this fuse should be 25 amp for the fuel pump, and this fuse is an actually dummy. It was for automatic transmission if one was installed and there are only 4 cars with them. This relay was for the rear window defroster. Very few cars had that. This is the main power relay for the control unit, and I don't know where this white one came from. They're supposed to be black. Only use a black one. Don't use a red one. A red one's got a diode in it. It doesn't work properly. This relay position is specifically for the fuel pump, and this one is for the hot air blower motor, which is down in the engine compartment that supplements the blow to the front. You can see the control unit harness with its, the ignition harness with its pins here. This little jumper is one that brings the blower motor power from the main harness, from the engine harness back into the main harness. The early cars had the blower motor mounted on top of the engine, so the later cars had to put a jumper in there to bring the power back into the main harness. That's what that jumper is for. All 73, 4, 5, and 6s had it. This is the plug-in for the voltage regulator. The voltage regulator plug-in is here, and the alternator plug-in is right here. Very important to watch when you plug this in, because sometimes these wires get folded over, or sometimes these pins get backed back into the bottom of the relay board. You can see what happens here. This is not really hurting anything, but this stuff flakes, and then it loosens some of these circuits, and they back in, and then you wonder why your alternator is not charging. The harness is routed along the back of the engine. Notice here the line that goes down to the alternator, and then it comes up and then goes back over here to the starter. This is the solenoid lead for the starter. This is where it gets power from the ignition switch. If this happens to fall off, you hit the starter, nothing happens. This is the main power lead from the battery for the starter, and then this lead goes down to the boot where the backup switch is. They're 2 little bullet connectors for the backup light switch. The wire goes across the back here, the ignition harness, and then it abruptly turns to the front right here, where it is connected to several different things. Now this is the ignition harness. The first one is the auxiliary air valve. Notice this strangeness here. It actually has a white wire connected to a red wire. Yes, that is correct. The auxiliary air valve is like a toaster element with a revolving door inside. When it's cold, the revolving door is open, causes a direct vacuum leak into the air cleaner to up the idle. When it is hot, it closes and no longer does any extra air leak out of here. If these get stuck, and often they do because of blow-by, the moisture coming from blow-by, the auxiliary air valve may stick open or closed. If it sticks open, the car heats up, you have a high idle. If it sticks closed, it's hard as hell to drive when it's cold. The power to this is directly connected to the fuel pump fuse and the fuel pump circuit, so it only has power when the car is running, not when the key is on. But don't confuse the white plug-in here with a white plug-in that goes to the thermo time switch. The other leads here, we have the green with black, which goes down into the hole, into the oil pressure sending unit, which is right down behind the distributor in here. This should have a boot on it. Very, very important to have every area of the engine sheet metal sealed so that the cooling air coming through the bellows flaps here flows over the cylinders and also through the oil cooler. If you have places where there are holes in the sheet metal, the air will leak out and you'll get less cooling, and therefore the engine will run hotter. Also, you want to periodically check the front fan for debris. like a washing machine on a spin cycle. If something drops in here, it'll stick to the outside. If you just put your hand in here, you won't feel anything. You have to feel the blades to make sure there is no debris at all in the fan, because that will certainly instantly cook the engine if you get a rag in there and there's no cooling air to flow over the fan. To continue the wiring, though, we have the coil marked with a 15. 15 always means key switched power. 30 means constant power. So I know that I look at 15 and I know that the key will be turned on and it will be 12 volts at this point. What we have here is a thick black wire. It could also be black with red. That provides power to the coil on the one side. And again, this is a 75 2-liter. 75, 76 are the same. On the other side, we have two wires. We have the green condenser wire, and then we have the smaller black with purple tack wire. And this is on the 1 or negative side of the coil. Anytime you see a 1, that means negative. And that is going to a ground eventually. It's a grounding point. While you're in there, you can look, the distributor cap is off, and you want to look at the rotor and make sure it feels like it's a little bit spring-loaded, because this is the mechanical advance. Often these stick, and you wonder why the idle is high. It's because it's stuck in advance. This one needs a little bit of lubrication, just a little bit, because you can see it's not quite going back all the way. But it's pretty decent for what it is. Now we come to the control unit harness. And for those of you who don't have fuel injection on your car, I'm very sorry. The control unit harness emanates from the relay board as well. 4-prong here, you can see that. And it starts by feeding the 2 driver's side injectors. And then it goes over. It has a branch here which goes to the air temperature sender and the throttle switch. Whenever you pull the plugs off, you want to first peel back the line a little bit and then wiggle the plug loose so that you won't pull the leads out. And then you can check the leads to make sure they're all up at the top. These are notorious after 50 years for backing back, and then you wonder why you have a weird electrical problem. You just pull that. It's nice to see the boot still on here. By the way, I can tell that this is a fairly low mile engine by the 2 stickers that are still on here. After years of use and abuse and hot and cold and hot and cold and hot and cold, these stickers go to hell and they are no longer left. You can see that these are in pretty damned great condition for what they are. That's a true indication of a low mile car, along with one other thing, and that is the rubber stamp. This still has the rubber stamps on both sheet metal put on there by the factory to match the lots. That rubber stamp and this rubber stamp over here. Right there. The control unit harness feeds those 2 injectors, goes over and plugs into the throttle switch and the air temperature switch, and then also right here the cold start valve, which we said previously only works when you're cranking the engine. And then something critical, these ground leads. A little hard to get to with the air pump, but these ground leads often lose their connection, and then somebody wonders why the fuel injection is not working correctly, and years ago they would rip it off and put carburation on there, all because of a silly ground lead. Very important to check these, and they're hard to get to again with this air pump, but make sure they're tight and clean. Can't be at all bad to pull them off, clean them really well, use some contact oil, and plug them back in. And then the harness comes over here to the thermo switch. The thermo switch for the 75, 76s is a 2-prong. On the 73, 74, it's a single prong. This is more like all of the later 1.8 and then 944, 911 models that used a 2-prong thermo switch, which works by heat and also by the heater element. So engine heat, if the engine's hot, it's not going to work, or the heater element, if it goes more than 10 seconds, it heats up and stops working as a ground, cutting off the cold start for injecting. Then the harness comes over in here, and we've already talked about this, the head temperature sensor, the pressure sensor plug-in, and the 2 injectors. The injectors fire diagonally, So left front, right rear, left rear, right front via the trigger points, which are on the front of the distributor. Trigger points need to be pulled out of the distributor. You'll have to take the distributor out and periodically polished up with maybe something like a business card, just to polish them so that they're clean. Not much power runs through them, so you don't need to worry about them burning at all, but they do get dirty. 3-prong ground, and then the left front, right rear, and right front, left rear. So that's it. I'm sorry if I took a little more time than I wanted to, and I hope I wasn't boring. Thank you very much, Dr. 914, George Hussey, Automobile Atlanta. And as a side note, I have a couple books out there. One called the Tech Tip 700, which is, I think, very, very informative. Our magazine Road and Track says no 914 owner should be without it. And then we also have the Restorer's Guide to Authenticity, which shows you down to minutiae what your car should look like when you're restoring it. Thank you again.